Our next speaker is Jennifer Roach. She earned a Master of Divinity from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology and a Master of Counseling from Argosy University. Before her conversion to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she was an ordained minister in the Anglican Church. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Jennifer Roach.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction. My name is Jennifer Roach. I am a mental health therapist from Seattle, Washington. I'm a new member of this church. I was baptized about 18 months ago. Prior to that, I was ordained as an Anglican minister. I gave up my ordination the day before my baptism. I have two loves. One is theology and one is psychology. And I love seeing how those two interact. How theological beliefs form practices, and how those practices impact the mental health of individuals. So today, I'm coming to you to talk about the subject of youth bishop interviews and some of the nervousness that surrounds those when it comes to the possibility of sexual abuse. Now, before I really started working on this topic, on this talk, I spent 2 weeks reading as many of the stories as I could find of people who have been through bishop interviews and it hasn't gone well for them. So I don't come to this unaware of the pain that is in this subject for some people. And I just want you to know that up front. I have that in my heart as we go. So we will split our time up in this way. First, I have some words of introduction about sexual abuse in a faith context and what its impact is. I have some new original research to present, as well as 4 reasons why I believe youth bishop interviews are a positive factor. They're a protective factor for kids, or at least some kids. I have some recommendations, and then I'd be delighted to take your questions. So we start by talking about clergy sexual misconduct and clergy sexual abuse. This is Amy Simple McPherson. She was born in 1890 in Ontario, Canada, and she converts to Pentecostal Christianity in 1907. It's part of the Azusa Street revivals that were sweeping North America at that time. And shortly after she's married, her and her husband go to China to become Christian missionaries. And Amy falls in love with the work. She realizes that she knows how to draw a crowd and she knows how to keep their attention. She's very good at preaching. She's a bit of a novelty. She's this young, pretty, white woman working in China, and she plays up the novelty to the hilt. She's very dramatic, she's very animated. The people love her, and she loves the work. If you think maybe of a mix of like Billy Graham and Kim Kardashian, that's Amy. So they're in China, her and her husband, and he dies of dysentery. And there were a lot of young women at that time working in China as missionaries. They were either married or single. There wasn't really a social script for a young widow to stay. So there was no possibility for her to stay in China unaccompanied, even though she was good at the work and really liked it. So she returns back home. She's living in Los Angeles at this time. She marries, and the couple has a few children, but Amy still has that kind of evangelical itch in her. She really wants to do the work, so she hatches a plan. She decides she is going to be the first woman to drive across the United States unaccompanied, right? And it's in 1918, during the flu pandemic, that she does this. She buys a Packard convertible. You can see it pictured there. She calls it the gospel car. She hand paints scripture verses and gospel messages on the side of this car. And her plan is she's going to drive across the U.S. Holding talks about her experience of being the first woman to complete this feat But really, it's just an attention-getting device. What she really wants to do is give gospel presentations. And so she does, and people love her, and she loves it. She reaches the East Coast, she drives back home to Los Angeles. She and her husband and their children try to settle into kind of a suburban, expected life, and Amy just cannot settle. So she hatches a new plan. Her new plan is that she's going to become the first woman to obtain a radio broadcast license, and she does. She actually pioneers the genre of religious radio broadcasting, the pattern in which is still somewhat followed today. It's Amy who laid that pattern down. Well, the radio turns into a church. The church turns into an entire denomination of churches. They're called the Foursquare denomination. They still exist today, 8.8 million people in 146 countries. They do remarkable charity work, and they love Jesus. Few women, before or since, have accomplished what Amy has accomplished in the religious world. And at this time in her life, she is greatly loved in Los Angeles, where she lives especially. And then one day, Amy disappears. This is May 18, 1926. This is a picture of the day. It's Ocean Park Beach in Southern California. You might know it better as Venice Beach. You can see in the background, that's the Santa Monica Pier. It had been built 10 years earlier. So what happens is Amy goes to the beach, and a few hours later, nobody can find her. And her friends search for her and can't find her. They gather a larger search party, which is pictured here. 2 people actually die in the waves searching for her that day, and her body is not recovered. So the search goes on for about 2 weeks. All this time, the church, her denomination, they're putting out statements about her being presumed drowned, and everyone in Los Angeles knows who she is, and everyone is aware that she's missing. Well, 2 weeks goes by, her body is not recovered. A local newspaper reporter starts to get a little bit suspicious. And he starts printing articles in the paper pointing out some of the inconsistencies in the story that her church is putting out. And as the story unfolds, Amy wasn't drowned at all. She faked her own death. She and a married man ran away together, got a hotel room in Carmel, California, and hid out for 5 weeks. As reporters kept asking questions, kept printing things in the newspaper, the couple realized this plan could not last forever. So they make a new plan. Amy is a woman of many plans. They make a new plan. He drives her just across the border in Mexico and lets her out about a mile outside of town. The plan is Amy's going to walk into town, find the first person that she meets, and explain to them that she got kidnapped and has been held in the Mexican desert these 5 weeks. And she finally got to break free, and here she is. She returns to Los Angeles with a hero's welcome. But it does not take long for the story to fall apart. And life and faith were never the same for Amy or her husband, the man she had an affair with, his wife, their children, her church, or the entire denomination that she led. It actually takes that denomination many decades to recover from the damage that Amy does, and it speaks to their resilience and the light of the gospel that they have available to them, that they were able to do so and still are in existence today. So why do I tell you this story? Well, if the ending was a surprise to you, it's probably only because of the time period or because of Amy's gender. We don't tend to think of women being the ones committing clergy sexual misconduct. But the story illustrates a point, and the point is abuse happens, misconduct happens in every church, no matter how unexpected it is. And today's stories go quite a bit further than the story of Amy. Stories that we have been hearing about in the news that involve leaders, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and these stories prompt a wide variety of responses. It's a very delicate and troubling issue. And because those local leaders have sometimes been bishops, it has given some cause to be skeptical about what happens in bishop interviews, and should a bishop be spending time alone with young people especially. People who are concerned about the potential for abuse in these interviews are right to be asking the questions. They're logical questions, and the consequences of clergy sexual abuse are serious. This is the movie Spotlight, which if you have not seen and you care about the issue of clergy sexual abuse, it is required viewing. True story about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It is not rated PG, and for very good reasons. It deals with very disturbing content. At one point in the movie, one of the characters who has been abused by a priest tries to articulate what it is like to be on the receiving end of abuse from somebody that represents God to you. So I'm going to read you the quote, though I have cleaned up the language a little bit for this audience. He says, "When a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. He asks you to collect the hymnals or take out the trash, and you feel special. It's like God is asking you for help. So maybe it's a little weird when he tells you a dirty joke, but now you've got a secret together, so you go along. And then he shows you a dirty picture, and you go along. And you go along, and you go along, and you go along until one day he asks you for a sexual favor. And you go along with that too because you feel trapped, because he's groomed you. And how do you say no to God, right? See, it's important to understand this is not just physical abuse, it's spiritual abuse too. And when a priest does this to you, he robs you of your faith. So you reach for the bottle or the needle, and when those don't work, you jump off a bridge. That's why we call ourselves survivors. And certainly is not just the Catholic Church, it's our church too, right? And full disclosure, it happened to me as well. You could read all about it if you wanted. It was on the front page of my hometown newspaper, the Modesto Bee, along with many other news outlets. I grew up outside of the Latter-day Saint Church, and in the church where I grew up, one pastor after another sexually abused teenagers. So not only do I know the prevalence of abuse and the damage that it does as a mental health therapist, I know it in my own life, in my own body, in the lives of 20 of my peers. So knowing that my purpose here today is to talk to you about youth bishop interviews, you might assume that I'm going to tell you that they're terrible, that they're wrong, that they're bad, and that they all should stop. Not quite. So I know people who hold this belief, and I know and love and respect them, and I understand why they hold it. I don't share it, and I'm going to explain to you why. First, we're going to look at some new original research that has been done. 687 adults surveyed for the Uplift Bishop Youth Interview Study. If you're unfamiliar with Uplift, they are an online discussion group, probably a similar audience to what the Fair Mormon audience is. They're people who are trying to remain faithful, but they got some questions. There'd be some significant overlap. There'd also be some significant differences in those two audiences, but they're not that much different than perhaps to you who are listening today. Uplift collected this data over a 10-month period in 2018 and 2019. I was not involved in the data collection, but they have been kind enough to let me use this for my presentation. So 687 adults, not every adult is asked every question, and not every question that's asked gets responded to. So we don't always have 687 responses. I wish that we did. So who is in this data set? Well, if we start with age, 50% of them are between age 35 and 55. 75% of them are age 35 and older, which means most people in this data are at least 17 years removed from their own experience of being interviewed by a bishop. But presumably, that 50% that's making up ages 35 to 50, presumably those are the people who are raising teenagers and are having to rethink through these issues anyway. When I received this data, my first guess, the first statistical test that I ran was, how does age impact how they're seeing this issue? I thought for sure the older people were going to tend a little bit more conservative and not want to see change, and the younger people were going to tend a little bit more willing or eager to see change. Age is not a factor at all in this survey. Could not have surprised me more. Gender was not asked in this survey. I wish that it had been. It might prove to be helpful, although I thought age was going to be helpful, and it was not. So how do these people describe themselves and their relationship to faith? Well, 70% of them call themselves active, believing members. They were not given a definition of what that meant. The assumption was the categories were self-explanatory. About 9.5% are less active believing, 8.5% are active non-believing, about 7% are less active non-believing, and 5% were former members. That's sort of how that breaks down. So we start by looking at people's experience with bishop interviews. And just a note, in our church, change does not happen because of survey data. And this is not intended to be a petition for change. This is a snapshot. What are people feeling and thinking about this issue? So the question is, should interviews continue as they have done, including asking questions of chastity? 56% of our respondents say yes. This number is made up of just over half of the participants describe themselves believing in some way. They're either believing active or believing less active. The remaining 44%, they don't really possess any belief, and they still believe that interviews should continue and continue asking about chastity. Here are some comments from some of the respondents. As a convert at age 16, my bishop interviews were absolutely invaluable to help me repent of sexual habits. Another says, as a youth, I made decisions based on knowing I would be held accountable. A third, when I was young, I was so afraid to share my problems. In a way, I wanted the bishop to ask me more specific questions. I felt so confused about what I was doing and if it was moral or not. But I didn't know how to talk about it, and apparently nobody else did either, because they never brought it up. So in this category, this 54% of people who say, yeah, these interviewers are good and they should continue, you do see a lot of conflict, a lot of comments from people saying it was really hard, or it was really embarrassing, but I can see the good in it now. And this may be the most interesting chart of all when you compare it to our next one. These are people who say the interviews should either not continue or not contain questions about chastity, made up of 90% active believing members and only 10% combined from every other category. Let me say it a different way. People who do not have a testimony of the restored gospel are more likely in this data set to be in the 56% that say interviews should continue than our active believing members. That should give us some serious pause. There's a lot to consider here. So we're looking at 90% of 44% of 687. What are we actually talking about? It's 271 people. Not everyone answered every question, but if you extrapolated it out, that's what you would get. It's 39% of the total population that was surveyed. How that relates to the general population of the church, I have no way of answering that question. I think it's a good question. I don't have any way to get at that data. Remember, this is the Uplift survey. This is surveying people who self-identify as folks who have questions. I think they're an ideal group to talk about this issue with, because you're probably going to get the leading edge of critical thinking on it. So my interpretation of the 44%, these are good people. They want their church to be stronger and better. They're not distractors. They're not trying to tear the church down, but they're worried. And they don't know what to think necessarily about these bishop interviews. They don't unintentionally want to put their kids in danger. They love their children and they love their church. I read them as good-hearted people. My concern is that they might not be seeing some unintended consequences that would come if teens were no longer allowed access to these interviews. So I'm going to pause reporting to you on research and give you my 4 reasons why I think bishop interviews should actually continue. Number 1, it's appropriate for a teenager's developmental level to be talking about this stuff. They are dealing with these issues already. We are not introducing these issues to them. They already are dealing with them. Most people would agree with that statement. So the question becomes, does the conversation have to be with someone, one, outside of their own family? And then if that answer is yes, does it have to be with a bishop? And those are kind of the main sticking points here. And there's some research that helps us out, not from the Uplift data, from a social psychologist, James L. Furrow. He's one of the founders of emotionally focused therapy, and he did some research on decision-making between religious and non-religious teenagers, and how do teenagers learn to make good decisions? And so he asks, does it make a difference if youth can speak with a non-parental figure about sensitive issues such as sexuality? His research says a resounding yes. For the best outcomes, youth actually need 3 non-parental adults who can help them contextualize their religious worldview into their lives. This in no way downplays the role of mom and dad and the importance of the family. It just recognizes that during adolescence, students are starting to sort of look around the world, and they need to know that it's not just their family who's seeking to live out these principles, but other adults who know and care about them are doing it too. It's no longer enough just to live out the faith of mom and dad. So we see from Furrow at least 3 non-parental adults, but does it have to be a bishop? It's a fantastic question. And to be fair, Furrow is not looking at the Latter-day Saint context. He's looking at a broad, mainstream Christian context. But his research would say yes, best outcome, it has to be someone who's in the bishopric. And here's why. He says, young people have to know that their issues are important to the highest level of leadership. He points out that teenagers have an intuitive sense about the issues that are important to their leaders and the issues that are not, and it matters to them that their top leaders care about their own specific concerns. So why should it matter to a full-grown man called into the bishopric that some kid in his ward is struggling with sexualized thoughts or actions? Well, according to Furrow's research, it matters quite a lot to that kid. And the kid will have a better outcome if he knows the highest level of leader in his faith community actually cares about the thoughts of a teenage kid. The cynical view here is, of course, that a middle-aged man would only care about teenage struggles in this if it were for his own gratification. But cynical is easy, and it misses some deeper undertows. So a common battle cry that you will hear in discussions from people who are against these bishop interviews is that they really act as grooming. And grooming is a process through which an adult readies a teenager to receive sexual abuse. But intent is required. Grooming is not any conversation about sex. It has to have an underlying intent to move toward abuse. Just asking a teenager about sexuality is not grooming. If it were, every time a parent or a therapist or a medical doctor has a conversation with a teenager about sex, it would be grooming, and clearly it is not. Furrow goes on to say the best outcomes for teenagers also happen when 2 other things are present. 1, they are held to high expectations as long as those expectations are reasonable. And 2, they're supported in telling the truth even when it's difficult. It doesn't have to be consequence-free, but the teen has to feel like they're loved and known and dealt with without shame. These things are true in families, of course, and the best version of this happens in families. We would never say that that does not matter, but it matters in their faith context too. And in their teen years, it's increasingly so. Second reason why I think these interviews are helpful is their peers are getting this kind of support. One of the things you will hear people say, especially online discussions about this, Latter-day Saints are the only church where teenagers are expected to sit and talk about sexuality, and that's just complete nonsense. I'll explain why that's true in a minute. The situation is sort of complicated because the non-Latter-day Saint church is not a monolithic thing. You could break it down a million ways, but I'll break it down Catholic and Protestant. In the Catholic Church, teenagers are absolutely expected to sit in private and have conversations about sexuality. They call this confession. It happens on a far more regular basis than it does for Latter-day Saint teens. It's essentially analogous to what's happening. Those conversations are happening in private. Anyone who tells you we're the only people who do this, they don't know what they're talking about. Protestant teens have a bit of a hybrid situation. On the one hand, they're not generally allowed access to the top leadership in their church, especially the girls. So they miss out on this element that Furrow is talking about, where they get benefit knowing that the top leaders care about what's going on with them. In Protestant churches, there's no expectation that their top leadership, their pastors, have any concern about their day-to-day struggles. Some quotes from a group of Protestant teenage girls. One girl says, "The pastor of my church would have no idea who I am. He might know my parents, but he wouldn't know me if I ran into him in public." Another says, "Well, I guess I would talk to him," meaning the pastor, "but doesn't he have better things to do than to talk to a high school sophomore?" So Protestant teens aren't getting the benefit of getting the conversations at the top level, but they absolutely are having these conversations with the sort of junior level of leadership that is over them, and it often happens without parental knowledge or permission. One non-scientific survey of Protestant leaders, the general consensus, over 80%, was that to refuse to talk about issues of chastity or sexuality with kids is to abandon them and to advocate the responsibility over these kids that are in their care. And most of them, 60%, said they were entirely comfortable having these conversations with one provision, and that provision is that the kid is allowed some privacy and that there are enough safeguards in place that the adult is not going to be accused of doing something, meaning there's an open door, there's something like that. So every church is struggling through this. We are not the only church who's dealing with this issue by a long shot. When the anti-bishop interview folks say that, they really just have no idea what they're talking about. Reason number 3, it allows for appropriate differentiation from their parents. The normal task of adulthood is that you have to go from being completely dependent, the normal task of adolescence is you have to go from being completely dependent on your parents to eventually becoming this fully independent adult in your own right. And there's a careful dance throughout adolescence of closeness and independence, and this is why parents and teenagers fight, right? But the adolescent must differentiate from their parents, and the religious adolescent must learn to grow from their childhood faith that is based in great part on their parents' faith to one where they have their own direct relationship with their religion or church. And youth interviews, though not intentionally, this is one way in which that happens. In childhood, up to around age 9, the goal is really for parents to have a strong attachment to their kids, right? Everything we know about developmental psychology says Kids are not going to progress through that time of their life without a strong attachment, and that changes around age 12, where what kids really need is a secure detachment, not an abandonment, not by any means, but a time when a child can learn to act on their own while still having their parent as a safety net. The holding on is easier than the letting go. I'm the mother of a 19-year-old, I can attest to that. But if you want your teens to grow up into being healthy individuals, you have to let go. What does it mean for a teenager in our church to grow into being a fully adult member? Well, adult members in our church who would like the full benefits of being involved are expected to give account to their bishop on certain behavioral markers, including issues of chastity, on a regular basis. This is a high expectation religion. And teenagers should be allowed to experiment with that reality as soon as it's appropriate, meaning as soon as there's something to talk about. Because if they are to stay in this church, that will be their reality, high expectations. So a youth interview with a bishop gives them a chance to experience this and play with it while still having the safety net of their parents. Fourth reason why I think the interviews are good, disclosure of abuse. So most sexual abuse victims do not disclose their abuse in childhood or in their adolescence. The average age of disclosure is 52. That's first disclosure. That statistics comes from the organization called Child USA, the national think tank on child protection. So bishops are probably not going to have a kid walk into their office, plop down, and say, here's what's going on with me. When adolescents do disclose, 75% of the time, it's accidental. They didn't actually mean to do it. But what happens is they say something that doesn't quite add up to the adult that they're speaking with. So while bishops are not directly asking about abuse, asking about chastity is close enough that some kids are going to accidentally disclose. But when bishops are so afraid of asking the next question or asking any probing questions because they don't want to be seen as abusers, it's very hard for that kid to disclose. I know we feel weird about it, right? About bishops, middle-aged men, alone in a room with teenagers asking a probing question about something a kid just said on such a sensitive area. I get it. But the asking of the questions themselves is not abuse. In the rare situation when a teenager does decide to disclose on purpose, it's almost always done in a very tentative way. They'll put a little piece of information out there and they'll wait to see what your reaction is. Usually, that piece of information is something small enough that they could take it back if they needed to. This was my experience, actually. I made a decision that I wanted to disclose about my sexual abuse. I had read the book Macbeth in school, and Macbeth it's about a lot of things, but one of them is about the danger of keeping secrets and how it destroys you from the inside out, and I was incredibly moved by that, and I decided I wanted to disclose. But even me, who was in this kind of unusual situation of deciding to do it, I did it in the most teenage way possible, and that is, I identified a leader in my church at the time, a man who was working with the youth, and I gave him one little piece of information to see what he did with it, and it was a test. And he picked up that little piece of information and asked some follow-up questions. And it did not happen all at once. It actually, I think it took about 5 or 6 hour-long conversations before I had breadcrumbed enough information that the only conclusion he could come to was that I had been sexually abused. So my word of advice to bishops is that if a kid gives you a piece of information that makes you suspicious or that doesn't quite make sense, follow up on it, ask the next question. You will run the risk of asking too far. You will run the risk of that kid or his parents being angry at you for asking questions. They might hate you for it. You will run the risk of someone thinking that you're only asking questions for your own titillation. You might be incredibly misunderstood, and blamed, and I am sorry for that reality. It is the risk you took when you became a leader. And as a former teenager who was in the midst of abuse, I implore you, if a kid gives you some information in the chastity part of the interview that doesn't make sense or that seems like a breadcrumb, follow up, ask the next question. One note here, what often comes up in the conversation with people who are against these interviews is they will say, well, bishops aren't therapists. How will they even know what to do with that information? And it's true, bishops are not therapists. I'm a therapist. I know exactly what therapists can do, and they don't do what bishops do. Our roles are very different. Let your bishop off the hook for not being a therapist and let him be a bishop. So, back to our uplift data. The next most significant question that comes up is, the question is not, did something inappropriate ever happen in a bishop's interview? Because the answer is yes. We already know that. You can read all the stories. The question becomes, how often are abusive things happening in interviews? And that turns out to be an extraordinarily complex question to gather data on. It's very hard to nail this down. In our data, it's very clear that there is a large percentage of people who believe that asking the chastity question word for word as it is written is in and of itself sexual abuse. I do not believe that it is. When we look at the data, and people seem to be saying that, we have to consider one of two possibilities. One is in their own bishop interviews, or maybe with their children, they were so still in their innocence that even asking, do you obey the law of chastity, was a scandalizing question to them. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they have a belief that talking to teenagers at all about chastity should be off limits, no matter what the lived experience of that teenager is. One person says, we should provide privacy on this issue and don't believe it is something the church should be speaking into. The critique of that is, of course, something like, even if teenagers are struggling through issues related to sexuality, we should abandon them and leave them to struggle alone. The church doesn't care. And clearly that is not the message that we want to send. So in our data, when we just asked the question, has anything inappropriate ever happened to you in a bishop's interview, the number is actually extraordinarily high, way beyond what you would expect. So we had to control for the people who mean they were asked the chastity question word for word, and they found that offensive. So once you take that group out, you get a number. And I'm going to tell you what that number is and run the risk that you will misunderstand and that this number will get repeated as something that it is not. It comes with a lot of caveats. So the number of people who say they were asked something inappropriate in a bishop's interview and they did not mean the chastity question word for word, in our data, 3%. That number has a lot of questions attached to it. What we don't know about that 3% is, were those just awkwardly worded questions that the bishop was kind of probing? He had no intent on being grooming, he had no intent on abusing. He's just trying to figure out kind of what the lay of the land is. Or Was it a bishop just trying to find out the extent of what a teen is even talking about because the teen is apprehensive to spell it all out for him, so he has to find the contours of the edge and goes too far? It also could have been a bishop who was looking for an accidental abuse disclosure and asks a question that the kid is offended by because abuse is not happening. So when I say 3%, that is a starting point. There's no way in this data to analyze it in any way that gets some of those answers removed out. Further research would be needed to figure out what that number is, and I want to be extraordinarily clear. This number does not mean 3% of interviews are abusive. It does not mean 3% of bishops are abusers. It does not mean 3% of Latter-day Saint kids have been abused in bishop interviews. It means there's 3% of interviews that probably should be looked at to say what actually was happening here. They say that good research just provides more questions, and there you go. So in the survey data, some potential changes were offered. Again, I don't offer these as here's what we should do. I will give you my thoughts, but just as a snapshot of here's what people are thinking. Number one, there should be very strict guidelines for what bishops are allowed to say. One commenter suggests the law of chastity should have a set definition the bishop reads from. He should not be allowed to say anything else, any follow-up, and he's excommunicated. It's pretty harsh. But it's also followed up by another commenter who observes, it's really difficult to be a bishop and offer any advice that's helpful without knowing the details, and sometimes you have to ask questions. Fair enough, right? The church has been offering advice on this topic for ages. This is a pamphlet from 1981 where the church offers 2 paragraphs. The pamphlet's called Counseling and Interviewing Guide for Bishop. They offer 2 relevant paragraphs here. I'm not going to read them. The first one basically says, sometimes you're gonna have to be specific because your interviewee might want to be vague. The other one essentially says, and you need to be age appropriate about what you're asking. The Uplift data actually touches on this a little bit when asked if respondents believe that it's appropriate to ask more specific questions to 17-year-old young men preparing for their mission. Almost everyone says yes, of course. More detailed questions for them than maybe a 12-year-old. So other suggestions that are offered, that there should be a second adult present. This is a common one, but like everything else on this topic, it's pretty complicated. For people who believe the chastity question is in and of itself inappropriate, that does not solve their problem. One respondent says, how could it be better to have 2 adults asking my daughter inappropriate things? It's still abuse, it's just being done by 2 people now. So it doesn't really solve that problem. But still, 64% of people say it might be a good idea, and the current church handbook absolutely allows for this. But in our research, almost everyone agrees that having a parent there makes it a little bit more difficult for teenagers. 75% say a kid's going to be less likely to open up. One commenter says, no one wants their mom next to them if the bishop is going to ask you about sex. Another respondent put it this way, the more people you put in that room, the more I'm going to smile and feel the pressure to say the right things, even if they're not true. Just a note, the current handbook also says anyone, not just teenagers, anyone may have a second adult with them in an interview at any time. Another change that is offered is bishops should just ask, are you obeying the law of chastity? If the kid says, what's the law of chastity? Bishops should end the interview, call in the parents or phone up the parents and say, you need to explain to your kid what this means. This is a parent job, not a bishop job, and they end the interview there. I admit that I see some wisdom in this, but the hole in it is pointed out by one commenter who says, the problem is when the youth doesn't understand what chastity is and you end the interview and call in the parents, tell them they need to instruct their youth on this subject, you've actually created more problems. Now the youth feels embarrassed because they're being forced to have a conversation with their parents about sex. And worse, this youth now has to explain to all his buddies why he can't advance because the bishop wouldn't let him. Now the other youth ask why, and it opens up embarrassment even further than just having a simple conversation of pulling out the For the Strength of Youth book, read a few sections, re-ask the question, done, and move on. My word of recommendation here would be parents. If your child is preparing for their first bishop interview, please have the conversation with them about what the law of chastity entails. In conclusion, I have some recommendations for both parents and bishops. Parents, the responsibility of raising these young people is squarely on your shoulders. The church has empowered you the freedom to sit in on those interviews if you want to. They have specifically invited you to do so, but please consider your teenager might need a few moments to say some things to their bishop that they're not ready to say to you yet, and they might need a chance to develop their own relationship with their high expectation church. Bishops. Jesus tells a story about the shepherd who leaves 99 sheep and goes out and looks for the one. And in our context today, the one, in my thinking, is the young person who might disclose abuse. If you are able to maybe be brave, maybe hear what they have to say. But what Jesus doesn't talk about in that story is that the 99 might get real mad about it. And it puts you in an impossible situation. And there's a lot of voices that will tell you that asking teenagers hard questions is equal to abuse, and it's not. You might actually be saving their life. As someone who was the one lost sheep, I beg of you, listen to the Spirit, and when a kid says something that doesn't add up, have the courage to follow up the question. Or if they give you a tiny breadcrumb of information, be willing to receive it in a way where they will be willing to tell you the next piece. Bishops, I do not envy you your job, but it might make a world of difference in the life of one lost or scared sheep. I thank you for your time and attention, and I would be delighted to answer questions.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting and enlightening talk. Really appreciated your time. I have a few questions here for you, of course. The first one is, how scientific was the Uplift study? Was it a self-selecting group? How were they invited to participate?
Yeah, absolutely a self-selecting group. If it were, it's not in true experimental form, right? This is survey data, people who self-selected to take it. It leaves lots of room open for additional research. I hope that someone takes it to the next level, takes that challenge up.
Okay. How significant is confidentiality in confession to youth? And how likely is it for youth to open up if parents or friends or parents, or there's no confidentiality that's suggested?
Yeah. That's a subjective question. I think it depends upon the youth. I think there's some youth who would be very open if the bishop said, hey, we need to loop mom and dad in on this. This is an issue where you need some family support. I think there's plenty of youth who would be more than open to that. And I think there's some that would not, who would say, I'm not ready to talk to my mom about this yet. And the bishop has to use his wisdom in how that's going to go down.
Yeah. So here's another one. What are your thoughts on some of the suggestions to modify interviews, such as putting a window on the bishop's door or allowing a young women's or young men's president to be present?
Yeah, I think if a youth wants the young women's or the young men's president to be there, if that makes them feel more comfortable, absolutely. And, some of our data shows you put more people in that room and that kid is not talking. I do think, like one of the suggestions that comes up is girls being allowed to have their bishop interviews with their young women's president. And I admit I see some goodness in that. And for a while, that's actually kind of the position I landed on for a minute. But the research from James Furrow says kids need to know that the highest level leader that they can actually touch in their faith community, that person actually cares about their issue. And the young women's leader, the young men's leader are extraordinary people, but they're not the top leader of a congregation. So why not give kids the full benefit of being able to know that their concerns matter to that person who's in the top spot?
I appreciate what you say about breadcrumbs, because when I was bishop, I had a situation, and looking back after it finally all came out, I was able to identify, you've been trying to tell me this for a while, haven't you?
Yeah.
And I wasn't picking up on it for a long time, and we finally did, and
Yeah.
we worked on things.
Yeah, most kids will not disclose as teenagers, and when they do, almost always, if it's deliberate, that's how they do it. But most disclosure is actually accidental.
Yeah, I could see that. Interesting question. What brought you to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
That is too long of a story for right now. The short version is I read the Book of Mormon, and it ruined my life in all the best ways.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you to move your hand up on your microphone, because you're intent. Move it all the way up to the red.
Up here.
There you go.
Thank
That's
you.
excellent. So the broadcast antenna is at the bottom, and that's what happens. So in today's fatherless America, might the absence of fathers in the home cause teens to seek out father figures in the form of male clergy, with whom they then might develop a relationship of trust that gets them both into trouble?
Yeah, for a long time, research has been done trying to identify what are the common characteristics of abusers, and most of that research comes to the conclusion of it. They're from all walks of life. They're from all characteristics. So most of the research now has shifted to what are the common characteristics of potential victims. Father outside of the home is absolutely one of them. Right? There's just no question about that, some kids are going to seek that out, and when they meet with a church leader who also has certain proclivities, that's just a disaster waiting to happen.
As someone who teaches accounting, which most people think has absolutely nothing to do with social sciences, I always think of the fraud triangle, where you have opportunity, you have pressure, and you have a rationalization.
Yep.
And it seems like that plays the same kind of role in this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Most research on abusers says first-time abuse, they were not actually seeking out, they didn't wake up and say, I'm going to find a kid to abuse today. It was just a perfect storm of they found a relationship with a kid where that worked, and then they carry on their pattern.
That makes sense. So to summarize, you are suggesting that bishops' interviews, asking questions about the law of chastity in an appropriate manner, is a good thing to continue.
Yes.
And that'll help our youth transition through to adulthood.
Yeah. The people who say that asking the question itself is abusive, I don't see that. I think it's a protective factor for kids who were like me, kids who were actually being physically, sexually abused, to open up a private place. If I would have had, in my context, another church leader who said, hey, once a year or once every 6 months, we're going to sit down and talk about some things in private, I would have spilled. And I was never given an opportunity, anything like that. So, yes, absolutely, I think it's good and it's a protective factor. I get why people are upset about it. And I think you would throw out an awful lot of baby with the bathwater.
And I think that having the regular contact that bishops have develops the relationship first, so that when things come up, then there could be some element of trust. And here I'm speaking from my own experience, that you're the speaker, and yet I'm trying to... I think that sexual abuse is a huge violation of trust in my mind. And so when you have that violation of trust, you have to have somebody else you trust. So with that, I thank you for attending and coming and speaking under this very difficult subject, and Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This is for you.